Once upon a time, nestled deep in the heart of a forgotten forest, there was a small town called Ravenwood. It was a quiet, lonely place where the wind whispered secrets through the tall, ancient trees, and the mist clung to the ground like a ghostly shroud. Few travelers passed through Ravenwood, and those who did never stayed long. The townspeople were kind but distant, their eyes always darting to the dark woods that surrounded them, as if they feared what lay beyond. In the center of Ravenwood, there was an old, crumbling mansion. It stood at the edge of the town, where the cobblestone streets ended and the forest began. The mansion had been abandoned for years, its windows shattered, its roof sagging, and its walls covered in ivy. No one dared to go near it, for it was said to be cursed. The stories varied. Some spoke of a wicked family that had once lived there, others of dark rituals and ancient evils, but all agreed on one thing: the mansion was haunted. One rainy autumn night, a young woman named Evelyn arrived in Ravenwood. She was a traveler, drawn to the town by the stories she had heard. Evelyn was a writer, and she was always searching for new tales to tell. The moment she stepped off the bus and into the foggy streets of Ravenwood, she felt a chill run down her spine. The town was exactly as she had imagined: eerie, quiet, and full of secrets. Evelyn checked into the town's only inn, a small, musty place run by an old man named Mr. Thompson. He was a kind, if somewhat nervous, man who seemed relieved when she told him she would only be staying a few days. "There's not much to see here, miss," he said, handing her the key to her room. "Most folks pass through quickly." "I'm here to see the mansion," Evelyn replied, watching his reaction closely. Mr. Thompson's face paled, and he shook his head. "You do well to stay away from that place, miss. It's not safe." Evelyn smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm not afraid of ghost stories, Mr. Thompson." He stared at her for a long moment, then sighed. "It's not just stories, miss. People have gone missing up there. Some say they've seen things that shouldn't be seen." But Evelyn was determined. The stories of the haunted mansion had intrigued her, and she was certain that there was more to them than mere superstition. She spent the next day exploring the town, talking to the locals, trying to piece together the history of the mansion. But everyone she spoke to was evasive, their faces clouded with fear whenever she mentioned it. The most she could learn was that the mansion had once belonged to the Blackwood family, who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances over a century ago. That evening, as the sun set and the shadows lengthened, Evelyn made her way to the mansion. The forest seemed to grow darker and thicker as she approached, the trees closing in around her like twisted fingers. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. By the time she reached the mansion, the last light of day had faded, leaving only the pale glow of the moon to illuminate the path. The mansion loomed before her, more menacing in reality than in her imagination. The broken windows stared at her like empty eyes, and the front door hung crooked on its hinges. As she stepped closer, a sudden gust of wind slammed the door open, revealing the dark interior. Evelyn hesitated only for a moment before stepping inside. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, and the air was thick with dust. She could barely see anything in the darkness, but she didn't dare light a candle, afraid that the flame would draw unwanted attention. The silence inside the mansion was oppressive, broken only by the faint rustling of the wind outside. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she made her way deeper into the house, her footsteps echoing through the empty rooms. She tried to imagine what it must have been like when the Blackwoods lived here, when the house was full of life. But now, it was nothing but a shell, a place forgotten by time. As she explored, Evelyn found herself drawn to the grand staircase at the center of the house. It spiraled upwards, disappearing into the shadows above. With a deep breath, she began to climb, the old wood groaning under her weight. When she reached the top, she found herself in a long hallway lined with doors. Most of them were closed, their locks rusted and broken, but one stood ajar, a faint light flickering from within. Evelyn's hand trembled as she pushed the door open. Inside, she found a bedroom eerily preserved as if someone had just left it. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn, and a single candle burned on the nightstand, casting a warm glow over the room. But what caught her attention most was the mirror on the far wall. It was an ornate, antique piece, its surface reflecting the room perfectly except for one detail. In the reflection, Evelyn could see a figure standing in the corner of the room, watching her. It was a woman, dressed in a flowing white gown, her long hair falling over her face. Evelyn spun around, but the room was empty. Heart racing, she turned back to the mirror. The woman was still there, her eyes meeting Evelyn's through the glass. Suddenly, the candle flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged through Evelyn as she fumbled for the door, desperate to escape. But as she reached for the handle, a cold hand clamped down on her shoulder. She screamed and spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, silent, and dark. Evelyn ran from the room, her mind racing. She didn't stop until she was back outside, the cool night air hitting her like a splash of cold water. She gasped for breath, her heart pounding in her chest. But even as she stood there, safe outside the mansion, she could still feel the cold grip of the ghostly hand on her shoulder. She knew she had to leave. She had to get out of Ravenwood and never look back. But something held her there, a dark curiosity that refused to let go. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the mansion, something she had missed. The next day, Evelyn returned to the mansion, determined to uncover its secrets. She spent hours exploring the dark, dusty rooms, searching for anything that might explain the strange occurrences. But the more she searched, the more the mansion seemed to resist her. Doors that had been open were now locked, shadows moved in the corners of her vision, and the air grew colder with every passing moment. It wasn't until she reached the basement that she found something truly disturbing. The door to the basement was heavy and made of iron, as if it was meant to keep something in rather than out. With a great deal of effort, Evelyn forced it open, revealing a steep staircase leading down into the darkness. The air in the basement was damp and foul, the stench of rot overwhelming. Evelyn gagged, but she pressed on, using a flashlight to guide her steps. The basement was vast, much larger than she had expected, and filled with old, rusted machinery and rotting wooden crates. But it was what she found at the far end that made her blood run cold. There, hidden behind a large, moldy tapestry, was a door. It was small, barely noticeable, and made of heavy wood, bound with iron. The door was locked, but the key was still in the lock, as if someone had left it there in a hurry. With trembling hands, Evelyn turned the key and pushed the door open. Inside, she found a small, windowless room. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with strange, ancient books. In the center of the room was a large, stone table, and on it lay a book, open as if waiting for her. The pages were yellowed with age, and the writing was in a language she didn't recognize. But as she stepped closer, the words seemed to shift and change, forming sentences in her mind. "The blood of the innocent shall bind the spirits," the words whispered in her head. "The sacrifice shall open the door." Evelyn's heart pounded as she realized what she was reading. This was no ordinary book, it was a book of dark magic, a guide to summoning and binding spirits. The Blackwoods hadn't just disappeared, they had been sacrificed in some terrible ritual, their spirits bound to the mansion. As she stood there, frozen with fear, the air in the room grew colder, and she felt a presence behind her. Slowly, she turned, her breath catching in her throat. Standing in the doorway was the woman from the mirror, her eyes burning with hatred. "You should have left," the woman whispered, her voice echoing in Evelyn's mind. "Now you'll never leave." The door slammed shut, trapping Evelyn inside. She screamed, banging on the door, but it was no use. The room was growing darker, the shadows closing in around her. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the woman's cold, dead eyes staring into her soul. Evelyn was never seen again. The townspeople whispered of her fate, but no one dared to speak of it aloud. The mansion remained abandoned, a dark, cursed place at the edge of the town, and the story of Evelyn's disappearance became just another ghost story, told to frighten children and warn travelers to stay away. But those who knew the truth, those who had seen the shadows move and felt the cold grip of the past, knew that the mansion was still alive, still waiting for the next soul to wander into its clutches. And so the town of Ravenwood remained quiet, its people living in the shadow of the mansion, always watching, always fearing the day when the curse would awaken once more.